Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, Unleashing Speed and Scale in DevSecOps. I'm Kristen Santos, Marketing Specialist at Sectigo, and I will be moderating today's webinar. And just a quick reminder for all the attendees, you will remain on mute for the duration of the webinar, but you will be able to submit questions throughout, and we'll answer all questions at the end. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We have Sandy Carielli, Principal Analyst at Forrester, as well as Jason Soroko, CTO of PKI here at Sectigo. Now, without further ado, Sandy, I'll kick it over to you to start us off.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Kristen. And Jason, good day to you. How are you doing today?
Great to be with you today. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. So we're going to be talking about, as Kristen said, DevSecOps and the impact of speed and scale on security. And as we talk about this, we'll start by talking about some of the trends we're seeing in development and how that drives security requirements. So as you all have guessed, well, speed and scale are the words of the day. So let's start by talking a little bit about speed. I want to share some interesting statistics here. Forrester did some surveys last year and this year looking at how organizations and development teams are building and releasing code. You still have over here on the left some of the slower movers that release half yearly or less frequently, and they build only once a week or even less frequently. And that's about a third of respondents who release half yearly or slower. But then you have some medium-sized, little bit faster movers, 26% that release at least once a quarter, and 35% that are doing either daily builds or building at least a few times per week. Then we get to the fast movers. We have 27% that are releasing monthly or faster. And Jason, I want you to pay attention to that 27% number, because that's going to be really interesting in just a few minutes.
Yes.
And then we have 35% that are building either multiple times per day or on check-in. Now, this is from the survey data from 2018. What I really want to draw your attention to, Jason, is 2019 and the jump from 2018 to 2019. So in 2018, as we said, we had 27% of development teams releasing monthly or faster. In 2019, that jumped up 11% to 38%. That's a huge jump in a single year.
Sandy, in my experience with development teams from way back to more recently, that number really has not changed over many years in terms of the speed at which things are released. This hockey stick jump in 2019 is really due to DevOps, and it's a major change now. It's significant.
It absolutely is, and it speaks to us needing to keep up with the security tooling in order to enable this. Development teams are moving faster, they're incented to move faster, so we need to make sure that all the security infrastructure around that will support them. This gets really interesting when we start to talk about containers and containerization and securing containers. First thing I'll point out is that really across the board, regardless of your approach, whether you're building containers as a service, you're using containers in a public cloud, you're doing something, in private cloud or anything else, across the board, adoption of containers is really jumping. You have, in the high 50s or low 60s%, regardless of your approach for containerization, about 60% of our respondents are adopting it in some way, and about another 20% are planning to adopt it within the next 12 months. So a lot of organizations are definitely going that container and containerization route. Now, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Sandy. With customers, I'm seeing different levels of maturity. Some of them have been on the bandwagon since 2014, but many of them have just started within the past 6 months or so to really start to get used to not just containers, but also the container orchestration engine sitting underneath them, and just getting used to those tools before they start to roll that out in a major way within their organizations.
That makes sense, especially when you start to look at the adoption and the usage. Something we talked about. So what is the animal on Earth that has the shortest lifespan? It's the Mayfly, and the Mayfly lives 24 hours. Basically, its entire purpose, its existence is it's born, it reproduces, it dies, all within 24 hours. And that is the shortest lifespan of any animal on planet Earth. And yet the Mayfly still lives an order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude longer than most containers nowadays. So I think, Jason, as we're seeing this increase in adoption, we're also seeing a real decrease in lifetime of containers, and they are becoming more ephemeral. Last year, 20% of containers lived for 5 minutes or less. That made a huge jump in 2019. Now we have over 50%, up to 54% of containers that are living for 5 minutes or less.
So Sandy,
and even more, yeah.
No, sorry, Sandy. I'm just going to throw in an anecdote there to make an analogy for people. If you think about how long your web server lives with an identity, for example, your web server is typically living between 90 days and to a year to 2 years before it needs to be recycled in terms of its identity. So think about the challenge now where not only do you have one-to-many relationship of containers compared to web servers, but those containers' lifespans are incredibly short, as you say.
Right. The challenge is, how do you manage something that only lives for 5 minutes? How do you know it's there? How do you implement the right tooling to manage at that level? And by the way, we're talking 5 minutes here, but in fact, 22% of containers live for 10 seconds or less. So in some cases, we are talking infinitesimal lifetimes compared to, as you say, what we're used to.
And with serverless functions, we might be down into the less than a second range.
Mm-hmm. So at the same time, as we're talking about speed, let's not forget issues of scale here. Not only do we have containers living for very short lifetimes, but we have more of them than ever. You still have some organizations that are maybe managing a couple hundred containers, but over on the high end, more and more organizations are looking at containers in the thousands. You have 9% of respondents of the survey that are managing over 5,000 containers. That's an incredible amount, especially when you consider at the same time that short lifetime. So large numbers of containers that are born and die very, very quickly, that need to be managed, that need to be secured, that developers and DevOps need to understand their ongoing placement and operation within the organization in order to secure the environment. That's the challenge that we're facing here, right? How do we build in security at that scale and at that speed? Very different than what you and I were used to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, coming up in security and in development. Very different than what we experienced, right?
Yeah, people are still struggling to manage their SSL certificates, of which that might be in the order of magnitude of hundreds into the low thousands if they're a very large organization. But now even medium-sized organizations are up into the high thousands of containers. So I think that the message you have here, Sandy, in terms of building in security at scale, this is exactly what we're talking about.
Right. So let's talk about why that's a problem. 33% of firms suffered a breach last year as the result of some sort of external attack. But it's telling that the most common approaches to those attacks are application level. You can see that the most common attack vector was through a software vulnerability, some sort of software exploit. And the second most was web applications. Over the past few years, those have been the number 1 and number 2 most common responses. And sometimes they've flipped. Sometimes it's been web application first and then software vulnerability, sometimes software vulnerability and then web application. But over the past couple of years, those have consistently been the top 2. What's really telling here is how much of a gap there is between number 2 and number 3. There's a 9% jump then between use of stolen credentials and web application. So it really is, an application risk in a lot of cases. That is how many attackers are getting through the door. And as we start to increase the scale of containers and have very short-lived containers, we have to address that speed and scale in terms of protecting and securing containers from application level attacks. That's the world in which we're living.
Yeah, at the last Black Hat and DEF CON conference, Sandy, this is exactly what we were seeing, where DevOps issues within DevOps are now starting to appear as part of the white hat research community. And so everything you're saying here is lining up with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen that, containers and images are not immune from all of these vulnerabilities. The top 10 Docker images out there, all of them have at least 30, in some cases, many more vulnerabilities. So, and that's not surprising. Any piece of software out there, open source, otherwise, there are always vulnerabilities. Containers, container images, none of those are immune. So we need to be dealing in that world and aware of that. And I think most security people are.
Yeah, and whenever we show numbers of vulnerabilities, Sandy, the one thing I always like to say is it's the not often it's not the number in total, but it's the one vulnerability you don't know about yet.
And the criticality. And a lot of those vulnerabilities are higher critical ones. One of the things that we've sometimes seen is that even vulnerable containers could be remediated if a user or an organization was able to upgrade to the later version. So we still have that challenge of having the latest image, having the best version, having the right image in your environment. That's another element that needs to be included in all of this. So let's look at some of the common steps and the best steps to secure containers in the software delivery lifecycle. And I'm actually going to focus mostly on the ones on the left, because I think those are the ones that are going to align best to what you're going to be talking about next, Jason. But using trusted images, not pulling images from unreliable locations or images that haven't been fully vetted, but that they have been scanned and that common vulnerabilities have already been identified and removed, and you're not throwing in something that hasn't been through security checks into your infrastructure. In general, reducing clutter, making sure that your containers and your container images don't have a lot of unnecessary functions, unnecessary entry points that really aren't necessary for the business requirements and for the technical requirements of what you're doing. Limiting the ways in, really focusing on what needs to be done. Signing images and verifying signatures. This is something that you and I have talked about a lot, the need to make sure that you have high integrity images, that you know which versions you're using, and that is shared and not just signed, but also validated and verified across the organization. And then enforcing secrets management, making sure that the passwords and keys and all of the information is managed in a secure way so that you're not, for example, as you and I've talked about, putting keys or clear text information in a container or in an image where other people can see it.
Sandy, I don't want to say this in a way that's too self-serving, but this is probably one of the better slides I've seen to help to explain to people in the DevOps world from a security standpoint what they need to focus on. I mean, 10 things is a lot of things to focus on, but these are the areas that need to be worked on. And I do think that, what we've seen already, a lot of problems with people putting credentials hard-coded within their operations code. And, that just that one of the 10, the enforced secrets management, that could be an entire, webinar series in itself in terms of how to do that correctly. But in terms of this 10, Sandy, I struggle to think of an 11th that's worthy of the list, and I think this list is really good.
Well, with that in mind, Jason, I know that you're going to be covering a bunch of sort of best practices and architectural ideas around them. So why don't I pass it over to you and we will continue this discussion.
Thanks, Sandy. Yes, so I'm Jason Soroko, CTO for PKI at Sectigo, and Sectigo is a trusted third-party certificate authority. So therefore, we're not in the business of solving all 10 of those security issues for you, but we're definitely in the business of trying to really look hard at the secrets management, the digital identity part of DevOps. So for those of you who are interested in DevOps, quite often, I hate the fact that this is still a surprise that I say it, but public key infrastructure is fundamentally important within DevOps because of the fact that most containers will be using some form of mutual TLS authentication to be able to speak to between each other. And that requires an X509 certificate. And that X509 certificate management is not a lot different than what you might be used to with your SSL web servers or your SMIME for email. The thing that Sandy talked about, though, is with DevOps, what's different here is the scale of managing those certificates. So just to introduce myself very, very quickly, been around for quite a long time, and quite a lot of interest and experience in this space. I've been following the DevOps security piece since about 2014. What I think that we need to do now, Sandy has done a great job of giving us some empirical measurement in terms of the trends and the mega trends and scales going on in DevOps. I think what we just learned from Sandy about just the sheer amount of speed now that DevOps is enabling teams to release software. I think it's worth just pausing for a moment and taking a look at the human element of this. You know, anecdotally, one of the real big pain points between developers and operational staff, that could be QA or it could be people who are actually boots on the ground at the customer site implementing software. One of the biggest issues between those two groups of people, the dev and the ops people, is the developer will be building software, will not experience a bug, but then it's captured in the QA process or the ops process. And then that bug is logged and the developer says, yeah, but this code works on my computer. Sandy, I think that analogy is probably like it's still a daily part of most developers' lives. It's probably the biggest frustration. And I know it was for me when I was a developer way back in the day. So just to continue the reasoning for why that is, if you think about it, you know, back in the day when most people were building on a purely Microsoft stack of technology, the beauty of Windows was that most of your dependencies were already embedded in the operating system. You didn't have to worry about where certain libraries came from. If there was a bespoke library you created, that's fine, you just bundle it in your software, but most of what you're pulling from comes from the operating system itself. That's absolutely not true nowadays when you're dealing with a multi-operating system world, and even in different distributions of Linux. So Sandy, if you and I were running a development shop right now, and we were asked to develop software for dozens and dozens of cloud-based Linux distributions, we don't know what dependencies are there or not there. That's why containers came about. I mean, virtual machines were a great way of giving you the ability to splash an operating system across multiple operating systems across a big piece of hardware. But containers took that idea one step further, one more level of granularity, and said, what happens if we can take a discrete piece of logic and then bundle it with its dependencies so that it can be implemented in the cloud wherever we want without having to worry too much about the vagaries of the operating system underlying it. Because, you know,
Jason,
yeah.
Sorry. So as you go through all of this, what jumps out at me as you talk about the human element, you think about 20 years ago when you and I were first getting into this industry and how much could be manual. It wasn't necessarily convenient. It wasn't necessarily that everyone was happy, but you could have manual management and manual steps in a lot of certificate issuance and certificate management capabilities. Now let's go to this point where you have to be issuing these things every few minutes, revoking every few minutes, constantly managing, constantly understanding what you have. Human element, it's got to be transparent to them.
The visibility for everyone needs to be paramount. And in fact, Sandy, I think what you've just done, you've skipped ahead is part of my story, which is the design philosophy of security, especially identity-based security within DevOps, is really all about making it completely seamless to the developer and the operations people. Don't give them just one more tool to have to deal with, A, and B, ultimately the design principle is to give visibility to everyone, and that includes your governance people, your risk officers, etc. So it's funny, Sandy, we're technology people, and this is the title of this implies a lot of technology, but we're really talking about solving a complexity problem that is leading to a lot of human error with another set of complexity. But that complexity, I think what the beauty of today is, we have the choice of how we can deploy that complexity, right? And I think the rest of what I have to talk about is based off of that philosophy. So with everything being said, right? So Sandy talked about the breaches. Sandy talked about the application vulnerabilities, vulnerabilities within containers. But I'd like to talk also about the outages and the non-compliance. So this, I think, what gets the headlines today, Sandy, if we were reading about the technical journalism on this topic, I mean, the most obvious clickbait is, hey, check out the cool hack that happened. But to me, I think if you're a risk officer, if you're looking at the complexity right now of DevOps implementations, you're quite worried about outages. And what did I say earlier about the proliferation of certificates? Well, if you're still struggling to manage revoking and expired SSL certificates on a half dozen of your web servers, what are you going to do when it's now into the 5,000 range of containers, all containing one or more certificates? And what happens if those certificates are issued with, perhaps with a deprecated cryptographic algorithm? I mean, Sandy, if we were to poll how many people might be using SHA-1 by mistake, what would we find, right?
Better than I hope, but probably worse than I expect.
So I think what Sandy and I are talking about here really is, I think Sandy's gave a perfect empirical measurement of just the sheer volume of certificates that we're probably dealing with now. And the short lifespan of those certificates is really something that, for those of you who knew PKI from 10, 15, 5 years ago, you might struggle to get your head around, geez, that was such a painful thing to implement my PKI just for an authentication use case. What in the world am I going to do now where I have lifespans of certificates on the order of minutes or seconds? And if you're a risk officer, if you're a CISO, the fact that now, and Sandy, this is something I really want, this is a key takeaway on this webinar for everyone. Things like Kubernetes clusters, which are your container orchestration engines. Very few people are just implementing, such a small handful of containers that they can all be managed manually. Typically, you're going to be using some sort of orchestration engine to help to navigate the complexity of all those containers working together. The problem is, those orchestration engines, to handle all that certificate issuance, all have some means of connecting to a certificate authority, a PKI. And I'm wondering right now, Sandy, how many Kubernetes clusters, various Docker engines that are out there, that the certificate authority might have been just a very simply cobbled together OpenSSL implementation that is sitting underneath somebody's desk and just waiting to go down. That decentralization of control should keep people awake at night if you're in the business of risk and governance. And I cannot highlight enough that if you're going to try to solve these problems, you can't just add more complexity. It's all, the world of a DevOps operator is already probably at the breaking limit of what any really good developer can handle.
Yeah, exactly, Jason. That's exactly right. If we want to make sure that developers use security tools, we cannot make it harder. We cannot introduce any sort of roadblocks or any sort of, additional time or blockers. It's got to be seamless.
Yeah, thanks, Sandy. So this slide is really trying to show, the day in the life of an enterprise developer, operations person. You're probably dealing with many of these things. You're probably VPNing into work or into remote sites, or you're using SSH probably as a DevOps practitioner to get into your cloud services. All these things have their own forms of certificates, right, to get in. You might also be running devices, mobile device management certificates. You might, at the same time, be having to provision SMIME certificates into your mobile devices to do email. Your code signing. Well, on top of all of that, you're now doing DevOps in a big way in the enterprise. And the struggle that we saw customers have was certificate management that really did not give visibility to all of these things at the same time. And so this is one level of complexity. The highest level of complexity is, wouldn't it be nice if we could give our customers a single pane of glass for all of their certificate management, regardless of what it was in their enterprise? So if we dive down into PKI in DevOps now specifically, if you kind of boil it down to a sentence, it's really at the top. We really don't want those developers to have to think a lot about digital identity management or PKI. That's complex enough. What they're trying to do on a daily basis is complex enough. We as Sandy said, the philosophy here really absolutely needs to be to not add more on their plate. And part of what we found as a trusted third party CA is we could probably boil it down to a few things, which is, Sandy was talking earlier about the vulnerability of not code signing your containers. We help to solve that by enabling code signing directly within your favorite DevOps tools. You don't have to learn anything. It's an automatic integration. The software is installed as a container into the same environment as your orchestration engine. There's no hardware to worry about. It's as simple as possible. You get your code signing. But as for, how do you integrate? We've embraced open standards such as ACME. ACME is a way of provisioning certificates from the certificate authority to wherever the certificate needs to be, a DevOps container. And for people who need something more complex or regardless of what you're doing, we do offer a REST API as well to do the same thing. But I think the most important point is on the right, Sandy, and that is the fact that all of these tools are incorporated and basically built directly into the orchestration engines and the tool sets that you might use, even things like Chef and Puppet, Ansible, Kubernetes, all these kinds of tools that you use on a daily basis or your developers use, were integrated directly within it. So for those of you who want to see a picture of what this might look like, right, your let's say two containers that are talking together with a certificate, there's mutual TLS authentication going on between the two. Obviously, the certificate came from somewhere. And what we're trying to offer, Sandy, is some flexibility here, which is for those of you who want to use something like Jetpack as a CA, because it's has a very low latency for issuing those certificates into your DevOps environments, we can offer what we like to call a monitor mode. And that monitor mode is actually basically discovering all the issued certificates coming out of that system and basically creating visibility to that certificate issuance, so what's out there. Now, for those of you who want to go one step further, we also have what we like to call an intercept mode, which basically means that you're using a trusted third-party CA to do your issuance. So therefore, we can either issue the certificates for you, or you self-sign the certificates yourself, and we can actually monitor that certificate issuance and give you full visibility. I think this is one of the biggest things that's lacking today, Sandy, and I'm really happy to say that this is something that we have implemented, and we've made it as simple as possible by integrating into the most popular tools that are out there right now for DevOps operators.
It's really interesting, Jason, as you go through that. We talked about when we went through the 10 steps, we talked about mostly the ones on the left, but all the way on the right was governance.
Yes.
And, having that visibility and that policy and that management into your container environment. And that's a lot of what you're talking about here. Actually having that insight and being able to manage and ensure that all of the different components are aligned with your own compliance and governance model.
Thanks, Sandy. Yeah, absolutely. So, I think this is my final slide, and I really want to, let's just get really back down to the reality of a day in the life of a DevOps person, whether it's a hardcore developer who's building software, a QA person, or somebody who works in the operational realm, an SE or somebody who might even be on the ground at the customer site. These people quite often are needing certificates to be issued to their web servers, their load balancers. I mean, let's face it, most DevOps applications are web-based applications, right? So therefore, there's going to be web servers, there's going to be load balancers. And not only do we have one of the world's largest implementations of SSL certificates, but we also embrace open standards such as Acme to make that as easy as possible for you. At the same time, that exact same set of people are probably remotely administrating their cloud tools using SSH, right? So, well, Sandy and I were talking just before this webinar about SSH key management being almost as poor as just about anything else. Most people are using a free implementation of SSH, and their SSH keys are just sitting on desktop. Well, the thing about keys, they're not wrapped within a certificate, and therefore those keys don't even have an expiry date. If some bad guy gets a hold of those keys, well, that's game over for you. So therefore, visibility to your SSL certificates, visibility to your SSH keys and certificates, and then also, of course, built right into Kubernetes, Istio, Ansible, Terraform, all these great implementations of DevOps tools. You can have code signing and Sectigo secured containers with fully managed digital identities built right into those tool sets that you use on a daily basis. So Sandy, I think what I'm trying to paint a picture here is of all the different elements of key material that might go through the hands of the average DevOps operator, we're trying to really make this as seamless as possible, give them full visibility, and allow their governance and risk officers to look at their environments and go, yep, I trust what you're doing. That's a proper bit length of an ECC or RSA cryptographic algorithm. It's not SHA-1, et cetera, et cetera. All these things that a DevOps person should not have to think about is now fully managed for you. In other words, there's still a lot you have to do in your daily life. You still have to worry about your provisioning your load balancer, getting into your cloud platform with SSH. You still have to do all these things, but at least the key material is now visible and managed properly. And I think that's it for my presentation today, Kristen. So maybe back to you.
Absolutely. And we did actually get a few questions in. So if you don't mind, I'll shoot those over to you guys. Let's see. First one is, how is PKI handled today in DevOps?
Yeah, so in a couple of different ways. Kubernetes actually has its own lightweight CA. I would say that if you're using any of HashiCorp's tools, you might be using Jetpack, you might be using one of the other tools that actually is there with it. So very, very lightweight certificate authorities with self-signing your certificate. With other tools, if you're quite often being asked as a developer or an ops person to run a bunch of Linux commands to set up an OpenSSL implementation. For those of you who don't know what that means, it basically means you're winging it. So I hate to say it, but it's either a very, very lightweight, highly scalable, but very lightweight certificate authority, or it's an incredibly risky venture of making a developer who might not even know what PKI truly is or the implications of protecting a private key, and having them just cobble together by hand a form of certificate authority. And Sandy, I'm sure you'd agree with me that the current state of DevOps PKI is it's pretty weak, but hopefully that will change in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely, Jason. It's always a challenge to evolve to something that is faster and higher scale, and that's really the place where we're at today, right?
Yeah, and I'm hoping that's why I think the question's a good one, because where we are right now is probably not where we're going to be in a year from now or 2 years from now. As Sandy was showing earlier, the rate of speed at the change of technology within this is something we're all going to have to stay tuned to very closely.
It'll be interesting to see how that 54% jumps next year. Are we going into the 70s or even higher?
Wow.
Who knows? We'll see.
Great, thanks guys. And another question, what are customers looking for when it comes to container security?
It's a great question, Kristen, and the answer is actually very similar regardless of whether you're talking container security or web application security or software security. They want products that enable them to move quickly, that don't introduce blockers. They want things that are going to integrate into their CI/CD pipeline. They need to be able to do their jobs. Their top priority is ultimately getting product out the door, getting quality product out the door. So any security products that we are introducing into that process, introducing into that equation, need to align with those goals and need to help enable development teams to continue working at the speed and scale that they need to go.
Sandy, the only thing I'm going to add to that is to whoever asked the question, and I think for everybody else listening on the webinar, I'm going to highly recommend that you screenshot Sandy's list of top 10 security concerns with DevOps. I think that was a great slide, and those are the fundamental building blocks that you need to be thinking about when securing your DevOps environment.
Thanks, Jason.
Right, and we will be sending out later this afternoon a recording of today's webinar, so everyone will have the opportunity to screenshot that slide or share the webinar with any colleagues that may be interested. So another question that we have is, what DevOps systems does Sectigo integrate with?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is we're going to end. I think it's impossible to do every one of them, because if we were to look at the full list of orchestration engines that are out there today, the list is quite long. I think we're endeavoring to have the 80-20 rule at the absolute very least, which means if you're familiar with any of HashiCorp's DevOps tools, such as Terraform, Ansible, Chef, Puppet, Istio, Citadel, Kubernetes itself, obviously, any of the orchestration engines. I think there's at least one or two at different enterprise levels that Docker itself is putting out. We're integrated with all the major ones right now, and on our product roadmap are others as well. So therefore, we're really trying to cover the most popular ones. Jenkins comes to mind as well. I think that's on our roadmap. So in terms of, if you're really interested in our current list and what our roadmap list is, definitely get a hold of us. But chances are, if you're using a major orchestration engine, we are in there.
Great, fantastic. Let's see. And Sandy, are there particular regions of the world that are leading container security?
It's an interesting question, Kristen. Forrester does look at container security adoption across different geographies. And the regions that seem to be leading right now, both in terms of higher levels of adoption and higher levels of planned adoption in the next 12 months, there are really four that I will highlight: the United States, the UK, France, and China. Other regions are a little bit further behind. There's nobody at, not doing anything, but those are the four that have a higher percentage of respondents going down the container security path.
Interesting. All right, and we are to our final question. What are the main governance concerns in DevOps?
I think, again, you need to go back to Sandy's list of 10. I think all of those things become governance issues because I think if you want to play the role of self-auditor, every one of those basically becomes a checkbox. And I'd like to argue there's probably dozens of sub-check boxes behind each of those 10. So perhaps that's a place to start. However, I'm representing this more or less the PKI and digital identity side of this story. And I think from a governance standpoint, if you take a look at PKI implementations worldwide over the past 30 years, PKI is so fundamentally important because of the fact that it's managing your digital identities. If you are giving up key material to the bad guys, if you lose key material, if you have expiring key material, if you have key pairs that are generated with the wrong cryptographic algorithm or not long enough bit lengths. I mean, Sandy and I could probably spend an hour just talking about all the different ways you could mess it up. And I think that the lesson there is don't try to do PKI yourself. I think you need to work with a partner. And the thing that scares me about DevOps at the moment is what we were talking a little earlier with, which is I think you've got DevOps people right now. If you go to the forums, Sandy, I know you do a lot of reading like I do. If you go to DevOps security forums right now, you have very earnest and honest developers asking basic 101 questions about, hey, I'm setting up an orchestration engine because I got a lot of containers. And there's this thing called PKI and certificates. I know that that's kind of like a key that opens a door, but I don't want to learn much more about it, except please just give me the Linux commands to fire up a CA. Now, if I'm a CISO, if I'm a risk officer within an organization, I've probably done, many years of, sweating it out over long sleepless nights. Did I get my implementation of PKI right for, so I don't have expiring certificates, so that I don't have wrong issued certificates? And now what we're finding with DevOps is we now have this proliferation of not just certificates, but a proliferation of probably not very well built CAs sitting underneath people's desks that are now running major organizations. That's a major governance issue because what used to be, enormous amounts of energy spent to get the implementations right in PKI, we're now going very haphazard with DevOps. And we need to be able to bring that into the fold. That's why I think the PKI industry really, really has needed to step up. And this is what I'm trying to show you today. This is the PKI industry stepping up to be able to give you that scalability of security within containerization. I think that was, one of Sandy's major keystone slides was talking about what is it we're trying to solve here. And it really is a scalability problem that we're trying to solve with better forms of PKI implementations. That's how we're going to get to better governance.
Great, thanks so much, Jason. And thank you, Sandy. I think that's all the questions we have today. I just want to reiterate to everyone that we will be emailing out a recording of today's webinar. And in addition, we will be providing you with exclusive access to Forrester's latest report, Predictions 2020 on DevOps. So that'll be a nice comparable read for you all after this webinar. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Kristen.
Thanks, Kristen.